organized this series, so it's my pleasure to see you here today for this special Wednesday lunch. Before I introduce today's speakers, I just want to do our usual housekeeping, which is to thank our chefs, Dahlia, and I don't see Tori, for what? Not here. Well, okay, Tori's not here, but we can thank Dahlia and the rest of the crew for today's delicious lunch. Thank you, guys. As a reminder, the crew cooks all this from scratch right here. So we do ask you to clean up after yourselves, throw your own garbage out, put your silverware in the soapy bag, turn off your cell phones before we get started, all that good housekeeping. I also want to remind you that next week, February 20th, our guest is going to be Professor Jenny Trinitapoli. She's an associated member of the faculty, and her home base is sociology, I hope. So check details there on the website or see me for more if you need. But I want to get to today's lunch. I'm really thrilled to be able to say that today we're having a special opportunity to hear from Professor Susan Schreiner at the head table. Susan. Susan is a professor of history of Christianity and theology here in the Divinity School. She's a historian of early modern Europe. Her research and teaching interests include the Protestant Reformation, early modern Catholicism, the Renaissance, Luther. Please don't just take 1 sec to look at your special menus with Luther represented. And she's going to be interviewed today by PhD candidate Mark Lambert, who's a PhD candidate also in theology, currently writing a dissertation titled The Sacramental Sickness, the perceptual interplay between the Eucharist and the leper Christ in medieval theology. I love your guys' titles. So fantastic. He's had the privilege of serving as a TA for Professor Schreiner and taking many of her courses. I also want to say before you get started that Professor Schreiner is going to be honored on Thursday, May 14th. Oh, Tuesday, May 14th. Possibly by God, but by all in the common room to honor her at her retirement at the end of spring semester. So that will be on the calendar. Don't worry about remembering it right now. But right now, please welcome Professor Schreiner and Mark Lambert.
I'm going to start with a little story. Okay, which is actually true, but it's also a warning. When I was in graduate school at Duke, I was getting my PhD at Duke. My closest friend was being very crassly and brazenly sexually harassed. Okay, so she finally tells her parents, who are from Alabama, and the mom shows up with a rifle, but we calmed everything down, and there was a lawsuit. In lawsuits, you have depositions. And there's no judge there to say you don't have to answer. You have to answer every question. So I didn't know that because I was first, they were going to make an example of me. I know that. Okay, I'm a character witness, that's all. Now they had me followed. And for 4.5 hours, they went at me, and I was the worst person on earth. The only thing they did not accuse me of was witchcraft, okay? They said the word Chicago about 500 times. Everybody know you don't know what you're dealing with. And so after about 3.5 hours, I was tired and I was beginning to realize, this is really bullshit. And so I just remember leaning back in my chair and taking a long drag off a cigarette. Those were the days. And I said, you're making my life a lot more interesting than it really is. That's my warning. Okay? I'm not that interested, so we're just going to give it a try.
Okay. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank Karen and really want to thank Professor Schreiner for agreeing to do this because
she didn't want to.
So my first question actually builds nicely off the deposition. Anyone who spends sufficient time in Swift Hall discerns our reverence for the primary text. This is especially evident in Professor Schreiner's teaching, as throughout the many courses I've taken with you, and I kind of have at least half a dozen.
I'm not even close.
You have continually underscored the importance of embracing the text on its terms. And one of the ways to do that is to pay heed to the influences and assumptions of the author operative in his or her writing. Consequently, from the many lectures I've heard, it's apparent that your father was a profound influence upon you, as well as the fact that, as you mentioned, you are from Chicago, and Chicago, not the suburbs.
We clawed our way up the suburbs, finally. At the end, we clawed our way up.
But can you speak to those twin influences upon your formation as a teacher and a scholar?
The close reading text was taught to me when I went for my master's at Harvard. And at that time, Carolyn Biome was there. And she gave a particular kind of homework, so to speak, papers. We didn't write research papers. And actually, as I look back, most of the professors there did the same thing as she did. They would give us a paragraph, maybe 10 lines long. You had to number the lines, and then you could only take 7 pages. Carolyn would just scratch out even the one line on page 8. You had 7 pages to exegete or interpret or explain that paragraph. And you did it line by line. You were told to look for metaphors, tensions in the text, the way the argument moves. You were asked what the argument, what is the author assuming, what presuppositions bring to the text, what is the author worried about. You did this constantly in every class that I took, particularly with Caroline, because I took most with her. And it just became ingrained in me that that's how you read something. I read magazines that way. I listen to the news that way. It was rigorous as hell to do that. And as I look back on it, what I realized that all of them, Carolyn in particular, what they were doing is they were teaching us how to listen. And that listening is an extremely difficult thing to do. They were training us to listen to that text. And you didn't bring anything to it. I mean, you read the treatise as a whole, but you didn't do research. You didn't do secondary sources at the time. You just read. We all had it memorized by the time we actually sat down and would write up a 7-page paper on the meaning of that paragraph. And that was one of the most decisive influences on me in terms of reading texts or listening. Listening is hard work, verbally and reading. If you to listen to, we think listening means, I listen to the content of what you're saying and I'm waiting to respond. Okay, that's not listening. Listening is, I remember in college I took a course on learning to listen. Listening is very, very rigorous and it's very hard work. And that's where I learned how to appreciate how to do a close reading of the text. Now, my father was a minister on the west side of Chicago, where my friend here, Robin Lovin, the great ethicist, remembers this area too, that it was, the most blighted. It was right across from the real Cook County Hospital. It was wild dogs who were in the area. People were warming themselves over garbage cans. I mean, it was a blighted neighborhood. And the church was just a little concrete building. When I came here, it took me a while, it took me a long while, longer than it should, to have realized that the students who came to talk to me had different reasons for coming to their committees. One of them was that they had rejected or couldn't believe the religion they were taught when they were young. It may have been a fundamentalism, it may have been a super liberalism, it may have been a moralism, something that they rejected. And they were obviously still looking for something. And I always, as I thought about that, I thought, to do that must be very painful. That must be very difficult to step away from everything you grew up with and look for something else. I just realized as people talk to me that's not an easy thing to do. And so I sort of thought about my own father, he did his PhD here in Hebrew Bible, loved Hebrew. I never could do Hebrew. I never had that experience. That my father, the theologians that he read, he often ran study groups, so I learned what it was too. Were the theologians I still read. It's the Reformation and Neo-Orthodoxy, the heritage of the Reformation. It's Niebuhr, it's Luther, he read every volume of Karl Marx. No. And that's still the heritage, and that's still the theology that I find the most meaningful. So I never had that break with the past. And the more I listen to other people, the more I realize I'm very grateful for that. That continuity is something I should never have taken for granted. That my husband teaches me. My father read me that. And my husband teaches me that my bedtime story was Sickness Unto Death. But those are the same theologians or thinkers that I still respect and mean most. So I think I was actually very lucky that one, my church was, his church that I grew up in, was a very inner city, tough neighborhood, poor as hell church. And I knew that side of the world, even though I came from an educated family. And that theology that I grew up with is one that I still return to.
And it sounds like your father definitely lived his theology. I mean,
He did.
Talk about he was a chaplain at Cook County Hospital.
He was a chaplain at Cook County Hospital. It was during the 60s, and he was a champion for civil rights. The church housed the SDS, which you probably never heard of, but anyway, big protesters, and they were going to protest something. My father laughed like hell because the day they were going to protest it rained and they called it off. He said, well, if you're going to have a revolution to create a new world, you ought to be able to protest in the rain, for God's sake. But we were an underground place for kids getting to Canada and so forth. But he was a person who, within the Methodist system, could have had any church he wanted. He could have gone to the bishop and said, I want the neck. And my mother wanted him to do that because we had no money. We had nothing. And I remember so clearly overhearing my mother and father arguing is too big a word. He never raised his voice. They were just talking. My mother was a great argument. He would and my mother would say, couldn't we please get out of this West Side business? And you could go to a suburb with a really wealthy church. We need the money. And she had every right to say that. She had 4 kids to put through college. And Dad just kept explaining, no, I won't do that. I won't leave this little West Side ghetto. And finally, he ended the conversation by saying, Virginia, at least my kids will know I stood for something. And we all did. He never had a dime, but we knew he stood for something. He was not going to leave that population.
So if we can continue in this biographical vein, upon entering the PhD program, my therapist emphasized to me that the beating heart of the most compelling research is oftentimes research, or those underlying questions that you are like bedeviled by, enchanted by, and reading through your corpus, whether it's both on Job commentaries or Reformation debates about scriptural hermeneutics, your work is animated by questions about perception and how we can be certain about our knowledge. So what is it about these questions that you find so captivating, and why have you returned to them again and again?
Well, it does come from my biography, from my background. And I'm not usually going to talk like this, but anyway, I come from a family that suffered from a great deal of mental illness. I'm the same one. When I was in 5th grade, I had an older sister who was in 8th grade, who was the sweetest person on earth. And of course, you want to be just like your older sister. In 5th grade, I walked into her bedroom one Sunday morning when we were supposed to be getting ready for church. And she had what I now know was a schizophrenic break. There were people in the room that were talking to her and that she was talking to. She kept telling me these people were there and that there were voices talking to her on the radio. What was she to say? And I ran and I told my parents, of course. And this experience went on, it still goes on throughout my life. My parents always tried to protect, oh, nothing's wrong, which only complicated. Because I think from that day on, without knowing, and I've always wondered, how do you know what's real? To her, these what we would call hallucinations, were every bit as real as each of you sitting here. And these voices were just as real as mine. And in those days, nobody knew anything. I know she went to a hospital, and I know that when she came back, she was a different person. Her personality had completely changed. A much more difficult person. And so all my life I lived with somebody who was sort of the walking dead. You know, she had the same body, but she had a completely different personality. And she continued to have these breaks. And all I knew was that to her, these things were real. They were as real as anything we think of as real. They were vividly real, and they bothered her. She had to answer, she had to deal with this, etc., etc. And this went on all my life. I mean, there were other forms of mental illness. I mean, my mother was hospitalized with depression. My grandmother killed herself. I mean, like I said, I'm insane. But when I started reading texts, at first I wanted to be my father. I wanted to teach Hebrew Bible. I couldn't. You couldn't make me study Hebrew again. I can't do it. I just can't. It's just beyond me. But what captured me was Luther. And I realized that what captured me, and the other readings I could do, but they didn't capture, was that Luther was so obsessed with perception and with the problem of deception. And that has question of what's real, how do you know it's real? How do you know it's true? When a person who's deceived doesn't know they're deceived. Nobody goes around saying, thank God I'm deceived. So I've always been, I've always, I think, thought in terms of the human condition, if you still use that word, in terms of both the scholarly developments that began in the Renaissance in terms of perspective. And that is bequeathed to us, this idea that people have different perspectives. We assume it, but people have all these different perspectives on the same thing. But the question of perception fell neatly, I think, into the questions that the early modern era were asking. Not everybody in the early modern era, but many of the people that I found most interesting were asking. Joe was talking about perception and perspective. That was a given.
So you've technically written more on Calvin, but would you say that Luther is the author that you return to more and more?
Yeah, I mean, I respect and love Calvin, which nobody knows. I'm the last debating person. But for me, it's always been Luther who is. Calvin talks about perspective and perception also. He certainly does, and he's very worried about deception and so forth, but in a different way, and it's expressed in a different way in the well, my first love is all of Luther. But I'm just telling you, I read somewhere in me, but I couldn't find it again if I tried. Maybe it was an interview. They used to have, interviews with theologians and magazines. Reinhold Niebuhr was on the cover of Time magazine. That's when things matter. What he said was, I think it was in the interview, that people shouldn't do theology or particularly read people like Luther until they were 40 years old. And the more I thought about that, the more I think it's true. He meant it in terms of it takes that long to know languages, to know the tradition, to know what theology has been, etc., etc. But it also is a theology that I think is understood the older you get.
At a recent lecture, you stated that, quote, the reading of the Reformers is not there to answer our questions, but to pose their questions to us. I think that probably everyone in the room would agree with me when I say that you are defined by your careful, considerate, close reading of these figures, and your conviction that they indeed have something to say to us. So in 2019, what would that be?
I always say that about reading any textbook. I teach the Reformers most. Because, again, it's a question of listening. Now, there are many questions that you can ask a text. But the first thing you do is you listen to the text. And you figure out, or you think with them about what their questions are, what their assumptions are, what they're worried about. And then you want to ask other questions. Well, I'm not going to read you, but go on. It takes a lot to realize that you're not the most important person in the world. That your questions might not be the right questions or the most profound questions. It takes a lot to realize that. And you can realize it if you can enter to some degree the thought world of a different era. In the 16th century, travel was big. travel journals were being written. Montaigne was a great traveler, particularly the red light districts. He just loved it. But anyway, he always recommended travel because it gave you a different way of looking at things, a different culture, different laws, different rituals, etc. So he was fascinated by the so-called New World. He interviewed everybody he could that had. I think of history as a kind of travel. You know, you can get out of the present to some degree. And I think today we are so weighed down by the present. It's literally a weight. We are imprisoned by it. It's every billboard, it's every neon sign, it's every thing on TV, it's every news, it's the present. As if the present is the reality. For us, reality is the news, you know, and it's just it imprisons us in a way we don't even see, which is what bondage has always been about in the Reformation tradition. We don't see it, we don't feel it. I've always felt that the present is just overwhelming, and we have no way out of this. Even traveling isn't going to cure it, because I don't think it's a uniquely American thing. But history does force you, if you really want to listen to it, to force you out of the assumptions and the questions that you are so certain are ultimate. If Luther walked in here today, we would not be happy. Luther never minced words. If the reformers, I teach the early Reformation, we'll leave some way out of it. Not the sharpest knife in the drawer. If Luther and Calvin walked in here, listen, they would, first of all, they would recognize that we are weighed down by the present in a way that future or past ages may not. But they would challenge us. And they would challenge us about what we assume human nature to be. Now maybe we are not allowed to use that term anymore, but he would. Particularly in America. I mean, it's not just the whole age, it's everything. But we are addicted to progress. Americans just assume that we're always making progress. That human nature can cure things, or that human nature is good. May have some problems, but we're good. And that we have inherited, they would certainly challenge our love of rationalism or our belief in the power of reason that we inherit mainly from the Enlightenment. And they would ask us, you know, what makes you think you're free? What is freedom? They would ask us why Christianity is no longer interested, or your dissertations are no longer interested in things like sin or the cross. They would ask why Christianity doesn't even talk about that much anymore. And they would ask us, granting our love of reason and our optimism about human nature and our belief in progress, but mainly today it's technological progress. They'd ask us how that's been working out for y'all. You know. And Americans now, today, are so sheltered from how that's been working out. Because we don't have a draft. How many of you in here have anybody, knows anybody, have a family member that's been to Iraq or Afghanistan? Thank you. I have to. Gives you a different perspective. Because without a draft, you're free from having to look war in the face or experience it or lose someone. In the 60s, I lost people that I loved in the war. And my nephews have been to both Iraq and Afghanistan and come back different people. You're never the same person. So that we are very sort of wrapped up, that we're sheltered. We're very sheltered in America from much of what the world is really like. And one of the things that would bother Luther the most, since he was so interested in perception, is that we are gradually, if you look, if anybody in the future bothers reading us or looking at our our films and so forth, that one of our problems is a gradual loss of any belief that you have any grip on a reality outside yourself. Now, it's not just that Trump lies every time he's not. It's that he's a symptom of this more than he is the cause. And the fact that people believe the wall is being built, why do we believe that's not real? I mean, in a very sophisticated way, scholars have questioned whether there's any objective reality. Now, the reformers knew that it was very hard to diagnose and to get a grasp on reality. But they believed that they did. And one of the reasons I like it so much is they stared it down. They never blinked. And they were not sheltered. And I think that they would call us on the fact that we are not really questioning this enough. And we're not asking the right questions. That we're, and the other thing they would do is they would remind us about something that may seem odd. One of the first things I know Calvin would say, and would say, theology is not about you. It's not about you. Psychiatry is about you. Pills are about you. I love pills. A lot of things are about your economic situation is about you. Theology is not about you. Both of them, in fact, at the very beginning of the Institutes, Calvin says it's about the relationship between humanity and God. And you don't always define it. That it's not about your rights, it's not about your feelings, it's not about your identity, it's about the relationship between God and human beings. And that when we come at it with the self being the ultimate thing, we're not doing theology. That's all.
Well, I do have more questions, but I don't want to monopolize, so I wanted to see if...
Just go ahead.
Yeah, Taryn, like, what time do we have until?
It would be great to, if there are questions now, that would be, because I think that was perfect.
Yeah.
Segue there.
Yeah.
It's not about you.
He has a question.
First of all, I just want to say that I think that for the rest of my life, every time I eat an Oreo, I'm going to think about the bondage of the will. So I
I
hope.
should tell the story because there are people. Okay. I always try to explain that the bondage of the will doesn't mean an inactive. Doesn't mean a will that's passive. Augustine defined it as not being able to choose what you love. And I always ask the class, think of someone or something that you love. And I wait for a moment. I hope that people are doing it. And then I give an example. I love cigarettes. And I love Oreos. I don't let them in my house. They're not, well, I fall off the wagon. They're not in my house, okay? Because I cannot smoke, I cannot eat Oreos, but I cannot stop loving them. That's the bondage of it. We don't have, now I think freedom and bondage today is that and more in terms of the structures that enslave us, so to speak, or determine. But Oreos is the example I usually use for you can't change your laws.
I was just curious, over your career teaching these texts and teaching the Reformers, if there have been any changes in how students receive them, how they respond to your teaching.
Oddly, most of my, not all, but the majority of my students have been Catholic that have become very interested in the Reformers. But let's set aside people that I advise, people. Usually they're just like, oh my God, this is what they thought. They're shocked, pretty much, that anybody would think human nature is that low, or that totally corrupted, or that one didn't have the freedom of the will, or that sin was so dominant. There was a young woman in an undergraduate course that I taught, who was the daughter of her mother was a Lutheran minister. I think she was going to be ordained as she took the course on Lutheran. Very bright young woman. And finally she told me, now her mother had gone to a Lutheran seminary, right? That her mother had no idea that Luther taught the bondage of the will or predestination. Now what? Now you're talking. I mean, you've gone to a Lutheran seminary and it's so watered down that by the time you read Luther, it's like a brand new story. Most people find Reformation theology depressing or just too extreme in terms of the centrality of sin or the centrality of truth. They don't know what to do. I think they find it interesting, but I don't think that they're usually sort of, gee, I'm glad we're not like that anymore, So I think that has remained pretty continual because it's new. Nobody preaches this. My father was so half one. Nobody preaches this stuff. You go to, as far as I can tell, the Protestant church is now a place that's sort of to raise your family as a good person or some damn thing. I have a brother-in-law who's Mexican Catholic, and he said that he thinks Protestantism is one big potluck dinner. So I don't blame people for finding it sort of surprising that this would be a view of human nature, particularly, that anybody could believe. I always tell classes, you get the God you need. any theology. You get the God you need, but what you need depends on your view of what you're being saved from. And it's very hard for us to imagine that we even need saving. Okay. As I've said a million times, we think God's lucky to get us, so why would there be any need to talk about a cross or something like that? But, so that element has always been there from the very beginning. Oh, my. Thank you all for coming. He gave us a lot of thought, and I very much appreciate his insights into what makes me tick and what he got out of my classes and for being willing to do this. Thank you.
Oh, privilege.
Thank you, Professor Schreiner, for the most quotable lunch ever. We're going to be making like little mini edition quotes from today's Wednesday lunch. Maybe a little bookstore.
Years ago, I wrote a notebook that went around with quotes for me. I didn't say that.
See you all next week.